The old farmhouse had been abandoned for years, but it had always been a source of fascination for the locals. Stories had circulated for decades about the strange things that had happened there, and the rumors only grew stronger as the years went on. One day, a group of friends decided to explore the farmhouse and see for themselves what all the fuss was about. They drove out to the property, parked their car, and walked up to the house. The place was in shambles, with broken windows and a roof that was caving in. But despite its obvious state of disrepair, the friends couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as they approached the front door. Once inside, they realized that the rumors were true. Strange things were happening in the house. Doors would open and close on their own, and they heard the sound of footsteps echoing through the empty halls. As they explored the house, they found themselves drawn to a locked door at the end of the hallway. It was the only door in the entire house that seemed to be in good condition, with a shiny brass knob and fresh paint. Curiosity got the best of them, and they decided to break open the door. When they did, they were greeted by a horrifying sight. Inside the room was a collection of dolls, each one with an eerie and unsettling look on its face. Some were missing limbs, while others had eyes that seemed to follow the friends around the room. But that wasn't the worst of it. As they looked closer, they saw that each doll had a name written on it, and the names were those of the friends themselves. Panic set in as they realized that they were not alone in the house. Someone, or something, had been watching them and had set up this twisted display as a warning. The friends quickly left the farmhouse, but they never forgot what they had seen, and they always wondered what would have happened if they had stayed in the house just a little bit longer. Katie loved going for walks in the forest near her house. She enjoyed the peace and quiet of the trees, and the way the sun dappled through the leaves. But one day, something strange happened. As she was walking along the path, she noticed a shadow moving behind her. She turned around, but there was no one there. She shrugged it off, thinking that it was just a trick of the light. But as she continued on her walk, the shadow kept following her. Every time she turned around, it disappeared. And every time she looked away, it reappeared, closer than before. Katie started to feel uneasy. She quickened her pace, hoping to get out of the forest before anything else happened. But as she reached the edge of the trees, the shadow materialized into a figure. It was a man, tall and dark, with eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching her. Katie tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She was paralyzed with fear, unable to break free from the man's gaze. And then, suddenly, he was gone. The shadow dissipated, leaving Katie alone in the forest. She stumbled out onto the street, gasping for air. Katie never went back into the forest again, but she could always feel the shadow, lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for her to return. And she knew that she would never be able to escape its grasp. As a kid, Lucy was always afraid of the dark. She would never sleep without a nightlight and would always make sure the curtains were closed tight before going to bed. But as she grew up, Lucy realized that her fear was irrational and gradually overcame it. One summer night, Lucy's parents went out of town, leaving her alone in their large, isolated house. Lucy felt a bit uneasy at first but decided to take advantage of the opportunity to enjoy a quiet night in. As the night wore on, Lucy began to feel tired and decided to head to bed. As she climbed under the covers, she felt a sense of unease wash over her. It had been years since she felt like this, and it was unsettling. She turned on the nightlight and tried to shake the feeling off. She lay there for what felt like hours, unable to sleep. Suddenly, she heard a noise coming from outside her window. She turned to look, but it was too dark to see anything. The noise grew louder, and Lucy began to feel frightened. She tried to convince herself that it was just the wind or an animal, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her. Finally, Lucy decided that she had to face her fear and investigate. She got up and made her way to the window, peering outside. At first, she couldn't see anything, but then her eyes adjusted to the darkness, and she saw a figure standing outside her window. Lucy gasped and stumbled backward, her heart racing. The figure began to move, and she realized it was trying to climb inside. Lucy backed away, trying to think of what to do. She felt trapped and vulnerable, and her mind raced with all sorts of terrifying thoughts. Suddenly, the figure pushed its way through the window, and Lucy screamed. But then the figure stepped fully into the light, and she saw that it was just her childhood friend, Tom. Tom had always been a bit of a prankster, and he thought it would be funny to scare Lucy. But seeing her terrified reaction, he realized that he had gone too far. Lucy was angry at first, but then she couldn't help but laugh at the situation. From that night on, Lucy was no longer afraid of the dark. In a strange way, the experience had helped her overcome her fear once and for all. It was a beautiful painting, a portrait of a young woman with long golden hair and piercing green eyes. But there was something eerie about it, something that made people feel uneasy whenever they looked at it. Some even claimed that the woman in the painting would follow them with her gaze. The painting had been passed down through generations of a wealthy family, but nobody knew its true origin. Some said that it was cursed, that the woman in the painting was a witch who had been captured and trapped in the canvas. Others believed that the woman had died tragically and that her spirit had somehow become trapped in the painting. One day, a new family moved into the old mansion and hung a painting in their parlor. They didn't believe in curses or ghosts, and they admired the painting's beauty. But soon they began to notice strange things happening in the house. Objects would move on their own, strange noises would echo through the halls, and sometimes they would catch a glimpse of a figure out of the corner of their eye. And every night, the woman in the painting seemed to come alive, her eyes following them as they moved through the room. The family tried to ignore the strange occurrences, but they soon realized that they were not alone in the house. The woman in the painting was a vengeful spirit, and she was determined to take revenge on those who had trapped her in the canvas. One night, the family woke up to find the painting had disappeared from the parlor. They searched the house, but it was nowhere to be found. But then, as they turned a corner, they saw it hanging on the wall, in a different position, and now the woman's eyes were staring directly at them. They tried to take the painting down, but it was as if it was attached to the wall, and no amount of force could remove it. That's when they realized the truth. The woman in the painting was not cursed, nor was she a vengeful spirit. She was a real woman, who had been trapped in the canvas as punishment for a crime she didn't commit. And now, she was seeking revenge on those who had kept her imprisoned for so long. The rumors surrounding the old mansion had always been eerie, but nobody had ever dared to explore it. That is, until a group of friends decided to break in one night. They climbed over the fence and found a way inside, each one feeling a mix of excitement and fear. The mansion was dark and cold, the air heavy with the smell of decay. They cautiously made their way through the halls, flashlight beams dancing along the walls. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, and the furniture looked as if it had been touched in years. As they explored the upper floors, they came across a door that was locked. One of the friends, feeling brave, picked the lock and pushed the door open. The room beyond was pitch black, and they had to use their flashlights to see. What they saw sent shivers down their spines. The room was filled with old dolls, their glass eyes reflecting the beams of their flashlights. Some were missing limbs, while others had cracked porcelain faces. The dolls were arranged in a circle, as if in the midst of a tea party. Suddenly, one of the dolls moved. The friends froze in terror as they watched the doll's head turn, its glass eyes locking onto theirs. And then, to their horror, all of the dolls began to move, their limbs creaking as they turned their heads to face the intruders. The friends ran, their screams echoing through the halls as they stumbled down the stairs and out of the mansion. They never went back, and nobody ever knew what happened to the dolls or what would put them there. But some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear the dolls creaking and rustling, as if they're waiting for someone to come back and join their tea party. Karen had always been fascinated by the abandoned mansion at the end of her street. The mansion was old and dilapidated, with overgrown vines and broken windows. Rumor had it that the mansion was haunted, and that the ghosts of the former occupants still roamed the halls. One day, Karen decided to explore the mansion. She was convinced that the stories of ghosts were just made up to scare people, and that there was nothing to be afraid of. As soon as Karen entered the mansion, she knew that she had made a mistake. The air was thick with dust and decay, and she could hear strange noises coming from upstairs. But Karen was determined to explore, and she continued to make her way through the mansion. As she climbed the stairs, Karen heard a faint whisper. She couldn't make out what was being said, but the voice sounded like it was coming from right beside her. Karen turned around, but there was no one there. Karen's heart was pounding as she continued up the stairs. She had always been skeptical of the paranormal, but now she wasn't so sure. She felt like someone was watching her every move. Finally, Karen reached the top of the stairs. She saw a door at the end of the hallway, and she knew that she had to see what was inside. As she approached the door, she heard a loud creaking noise. The door was opening by itself. Karen hesitated for a moment, but then she pushed the door open. Inside, she saw a room filled with old furniture and dusty books. But there was something else in the room too. Something that made Karen's blood run cold. Sitting in the center of the room was a figure. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, with long black hair covering her face. The woman was holding a book in her lap, and she was staring straight at Karen. Karen tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The woman stood up, and Karen could see the anger in her eyes. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The woman vanished into thin air, leaving Karen alone in the room. Karen never went back to the mansion again. She had seen something that she couldn't explain, and she knew that the rumors of ghosts were true. From that day on, Karen was a believer in the paranormal, and she knew that there were things in this world that were beyond our understanding. Sarah had always been skeptical of the paranormal. She thought that all the ghost stories and hauntings were just made up to scare people. But one night, something happened that changed her mind. Sarah was staying at an old hotel in the countryside. She had chosen the hotel because of its rustic charm and history. But as soon as she arrived, she felt uneasy. The atmosphere was oppressive, and there was a sense of heaviness in the air. That night, Sarah went to bed early, exhausted from her journey. But she was woken up in the middle of the night by a loud banging on her door. She jumped out of bed, heart racing, and opened the door. But there was no one there. Sarah tried to rationalize the noise, telling herself that it was just a wind or an animal. But then she heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy footsteps that seemed to be getting closer. Sarah's fear turned to terror when she saw a figure at the end of the hallway. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, with long dark hair covering her face. The woman was walking towards her, slowly but steadily. Sarah tried to run, but her feet felt like they were stuck to the ground. The woman was getting closer and closer, and Sarah could see the hatred in her eyes. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The woman vanished into thin air, leaving Sarah alone in the empty hallway. Sarah couldn't explain what had happened. She was convinced that she had seen a ghost, and that the hotel was haunted. She never returned to that hotel again, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the ghostly woman was still watching her, even from beyond the grave. Julia had always been fascinated by abandoned places. So when she heard about an old hospital on the outskirts of town that had been shut down for years, she couldn't resist exploring it. She arrived at the hospital late at night, her heart pounding with excitement. The place was creepy, with broken windows and peeling paint. But to Julia, it was beautiful in its own way. As she explored the empty halls and rooms, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. But she dismissed the feeling as nerves and continued on. That's when she heard it. A faint whisper that seemed to be coming from one of the rooms. Julia felt a chill run down her spine as she cautiously made her way towards the sound. The room was dark, with only a small amount of moonlight filtering through the broken window. Julia saw a figure in the corner of the room and she froze. It was a woman, sitting on the floor with her head in her hands. Julia asked if the woman was okay, but she didn't respond. As Julia got closer, she noticed that the woman's skin was cold and pale. And then she saw the blood stains on the woman's clothes. Julia realized too late that she had stumbled upon the crime scene. She ran out of the hospital, frantically calling the police. When they arrived, they found the body of a woman who had been murdered and left to die in the abandoned hospital. Julia was never the same after that night. She couldn't stop thinking about the woman she had seen, and the terror she must have experienced in her last moments. She stopped exploring abandoned places, realizing that sometimes, the past should stay buried. When Lily moved into her new apartment, she was excited to start a new chapter in her life. She had just landed her dream job and was looking forward to living on her own for the first time. But as the days passed, Lily began to feel uneasy in her new home. She would often wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like she was being watched. Strange things started happening too, like objects moving on their own and doors opening and closing by themselves. At first, Lily tried to convince herself that she was just being paranoid. But then, one night, she woke up to find a woman standing at the foot of her bed. The woman was wearing old-fashioned clothes and had a sad expression on her face. Lily screamed, but the woman didn't move. She just stood there, staring at her. Finally, Lily mustered up the courage to turn on the light. When she did, the woman was gone. Lily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about her apartment. She decided to do some research and discovered that the building was over 100 years old and had a dark history. It turned out that the woman Lily had seen in her room was a former resident of the building who had died in a tragic accident. Her spirit was said to still haunt the halls of the apartment complex. Lily tried to ignore the strange occurrences and carry on with her life, but the ghostly presence in her apartment only grew stronger. One night, as she was getting ready for bed, Lily heard a whisper in her ear. It was a voice she recognized as the woman's. "Get out," the voice said. "Get out before it's too late." Lily knew then that she had to leave. She packed her bags and left the apartment, never looking back. But even as she moved into her new home, she couldn't help but wonder what other spirits lurked in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. Sophie had always been fascinated by the supernatural. She loved reading ghost stories and watching horror movies. One day, while browsing the internet, she came across a website that claimed to offer real-life ghost tours. Without hesitating, Sophie signed up for a tour of a supposedly haunted house in the nearby countryside. The tour was set to take place that very night, and Sophie couldn't wait to experience something truly spooky. As she arrived at the house, Sophie was immediately struck by its eerie appearance. The walls were covered in ivy, and the windows were boarded up. She followed the tour guide through the creaky front door and into the dark hallway. The guide explained that the house was once owned by a wealthy family who had all died under mysterious circumstances. Rumor had it that their ghosts still haunted the halls of the house, seeking revenge on those who dared to enter. Sophie listened intently as the guide led the group through the house, pointing out various spots where supernatural activity had been reported. But as they reached the top of the stairs, Sophie suddenly felt a cold breeze brush past her. She shivered, but tried to brush it off as a draft. The group continued on, and Sophie began to feel increasingly uneasy. As they entered a dimly lit room, she noticed a strange figure standing in the corner. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, with long black hair covering her face. Sophie gasped, but the guide assured her that it was just a mannequin used to add to the creepy atmosphere of the house. Sophie tried to calm down, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the mannequin was watching her. As the tour came to an end, Sophie was relieved to be leaving the haunted house. But as she walked back to her car, she realized that she had left her phone inside. Without hesitating, she ran back inside to retrieve it. As she entered the house once more, Sophie felt a cold hand grab her shoulder. She turned around, only to find the mannequin standing right behind her. But then, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The mannequin's eyes were moving, and it was smiling at her. Sophie realized that it wasn't a mannequin at all, but a real woman, possessed by the spirits of the haunted house. She screamed, but it was too late. The ghost had claimed another victim,